What do you say to the White House statement that China agreed in principle that the Strait of Hormuz should be open and no nation should be charging a toll on maritime traffic? Some people interpret that as somehow China is backstabbing Iran. I like to get your take on that.
Well, again, the sequence of meetings. Arachi arrives in Beijing, has a meeting before the Chinese side and the Americans met. Look, I think China's position on the war and the situation in the Strait of Hormuz is actually quite straightforward. It would have preferred the war not happen, number one. It would prefer that the war end, number two. It would prefer that ships could flow as freely as possible. And in fact, in an ideal world, we would go back to the status quo ante, number three. And number four, anybody in their right mind would, of course, not be willingly accepting of the need to pay fees. That's pretty straightforward. And it's a simple thing to agree to those propositions. Yep, should be open, for sure, absolutely. There should be no tolls, absolutely, no problems at all either. But then there's reality. And the difference between the American view and the Chinese view is not on what a desirable ideal state might be. It's actually on the diagnosis of what caused the problem in the first place and what the solutions therefore are and what possible solutions are available. And you'll recall that after Arachi visited, the statements that came out from Arachi and also from the Chinese Foreign Affairs Ministry actually talked about a settlement in the Persian Gulf that involved a new security architecture agreed to by the nation states of the region, meaning without American presence in the area, certainly not in the way that they've been, and that the agreement be built on the idea of good neighborliness. So China does have a view about what the future looks like, and it's a view that's based on an understanding of what's actually happened. There is no return to the status quo ante, right? So yes, should be open. Yes, there should be no fees. But how do you even get remotely close to those outcomes? And the Americans have no military answer to the problems that they caused by initiating this war. And we see this because President Trump has again, after having threatened all sorts of calamity on Iran, has, under the guise of being requested to defer the next round of attacks, has deferred the next round of attacks. There is no simple, straightforward military solution. China actually understands this. So whilst it can, agree on these questions of sort of principle, it also knows that in reality, you've got to just move on and deal with reality as it is. The other factor to remember is that ships continue to flow, but they need to coordinate with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and of course that's not an easy thing to do, quite clearly, because the numbers have fallen dramatically from about 140 ships a day down to a trickle. But the Iranians have established the new authority. A regime is emerging in terms of what the administrative processes they expect to be adhered to are likely to be. And as these sort of new systems emerge, I wouldn't be surprised if more ships begin to flow again, but under new conditions. Whether the Americans then out in the wider ocean seeks to interdict these ships will be a matter for the Americans, and we'll watch with interest how they respond. But so from China's point of view, certainly things aren't flowing like they once did. There is some flow. Ships are moving, taking oil and other things to China, and they're getting on with reality.
There's also a lot of the Western press right now. They're asking a question about Taiwan. Did Trump, or did he not sell out Taiwan? And he was in fact asked about specifically the Taiwan issue, where Trump says, "Well, Taiwan is pretty close to mainland China. It's pretty far from us." And so, what do you take of that Trump's statement, does that mean there's some change afoot in American approach toward Taiwan and mainland China?
Look, I think we've got to always remember that presidents come and go, but the machinery of state tends to be relatively permanent. And the Taiwan lobby, so to speak, has been an active and permanent feature of the American political institution since roughly 1950. They have had various levels of influence over the course of the last 75 years, but they have been a permanent feature of American domestic politics, contributing finance and influence to different degrees at different times. So, and they've of course become quite embedded into the apparatuses of state and the surrounding ecosystem through think tanks, involvement in political parties, political action committees, and those sorts of things. So the idea that a president can singularly and in one stroke of the pen or in one small moment fundamentally alter that set of attitudes and perspectives that have been around now for 7+ decades, I think is a little bit fanciful. Certainly, I don't anticipate President Trump signing any executive orders concerning Taiwan. Right, so we've got to take that context into account. I think he made at least two sort of interesting types of remarks about Taiwan that are probably worth just trying to pick over a little bit. One was the issue of arms sales that he has yet to approve, and it was interesting that he talked about those arms sales, the pending arms sales, as bargaining chips. The Taiwan Act, of course, does not view things that way, and it was on that basis that the congressional voices, the traditional voices, if you will, had a total apoplectic reaction to all of that. You can't bargain, this question. Well, anyway, let's see what President Trump does on that. The other thing was this attitude that he displayed, and he talked about this issue of Taiwan being 9,500 miles away. It's only 59 miles from mainland China. It's a little bit further than that, but not that much further. But I think he was making a point that that the island is actually very, very close to the Chinese mainland, and it's a very, very, very long way away from the American mainland. And in that context, he also talked about the chips, which I'll come back to, I guess, in a tick. But he made these remarks in the context of an observation about about Lai Ching-te and his leanings and his party's stated platform objectives of abolishing the Republic of China and declaring a Republic of Taiwan. In other words, Taiwanese independence. So he made that remark about the distance, specifically about there being some people on the island who want independence. And he said, and if they want independence and think that America is going to come along and fight this war for them, they need to, have a cold shower and reflect upon the reality that President Trump then articulated, which is, look, we're a long way away, and and implied in essence that that if you want to fight a war of independence, don't count on us. That's actually quite consistent with long-term American policy, ambiguity in a sense, and officially not supporting Taiwanese independence. So in some ways, in his own colorful way, President Trump reaffirmed American policy. We don't support Taiwanese independence. And it was interesting that Lai Ching-te then spent the next day trying to scramble around with different formulations of what he meant by independence and stuff. And all it tells you is that what may have been progress from an independent point of view over the course of, say, the last 10 years has already begun to unravel, partly because of Zheng Liwen's visit to the mainland, but also I think broadly speaking, this, there is a little bit of shift in mood on the island itself. There is growing concern right across East and Southeast Asia and North Asia about the changing landscape as a result of America's incapacity to defend its bases in the Middle East, and consequently concerns about whether it can even defend its bases in Asia. And if it can't do any of that, then the entire deterrence architecture that had been built up over the course of the last 7+ decades is over. Now, how are people responding to that? Well, some people are responding with some, concern. Others are desperately trying to rope the Americans back in. So that's Lai Ching-te, that's the Philippines. Japan's actually not, right? Japan's not trying to rope America in. Japan's using this as an opportunity to say, we'll fill the breach. For you, of course. But for them, it's both, well, it's an opportunity, right? It's a concern. The Japanese have long been scared of, frightened about China. And as China's emerged as by far the largest economy in the region and in fact the world, the Japanese have been, concerned about that. Whether that's rational or not is a bit beside the point, but I think it's fair to say that there are many in the Japanese political system and within their security environment or national security environment who do view China's rise as something to be frightened of. So in that context, the Japanese are clearly wanting to muscle up a bit. The fact that they sort of contextualized that in relation to the question of Taiwan, I think was unnecessary. It was unnecessarily provocative because in many ways they could have built up their military under the pretext of supporting the American ambitions in the region as a good ally without even having to stir up the Taiwan hornet's nest, but they did that anyway. The Philippines, we know, Marcos Jr. said, I think in the last 48 hours that from his point of view, it was inconceivable that the Philippines could not become involved in a Taiwan Straits conflict. And frankly, if there is anything that embodies a loss of national sovereignty, then that's probably it. That a country basically says, look, we have no choice but to join into someone else's war. That's a very
and that's crazy that he made that statement while there was a literal gunfight breaking out in the Filipino Senate because he was trying to impeach the vice president of the Philippines. And I think that might just be him trying to distract the public from the real domestic issue he's having internally.
Look, I think the Philippines obviously is confronting some very significant challenges at the moment. Obviously, the energy crisis is the most pressing of them. And ultimately, these sorts of very, very real things that affect the livelihoods of people begin to assert themselves, right? You can have whatever ideological leanings, that you might have, but if people can't get from A to B and they can't access food and essentials of life and they can't deliver things, then you start to have real problems. And in some regards, they're not really ideological problems. They are just material problems that you need to find practical solutions to. And unsurprisingly, the Philippines, whilst carrying on a little bit about the South China Sea and Taiwan and China, is also putting out feelers to the People's Republic of China to collaborate on exploring natural energy reserves in the South China Sea in some of the disputed areas. So, reality does bat last, and energy reality and food reality is the most significant, reality that countries have to face.
So, Philippines is a big importer of energy. They depend on import of gasoline, diesel, fertilizers. And the biggest exporter in Asia Pacific region of gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and fertilizers is actually China. And China's decision to lift the ban on export of refined petroleum product is actually what's saving Southeast Asia at the moment.
It's also giving Australia an extra 4 days of jet fuel. So look, this whole situation is incredibly fluid. But so look, I guess coming back, I don't think China's thrown Iran under the bus or sold them out at all. I think China recognizes realities as what they are. That Iran is currently involved in a war, and the war does have wider implications, quite obviously. But Iran has successfully demonstrated its ability to push the Americans not just back but out of the region so far. And as much as China would prefer all of this to have not happened, it has happened. And yes, it would like the world to go back to something resembling, normality ex ante, but that's not going to happen either. The American situation, I think, is actually far more fragile than it appears as well, which I think partly explains President Trump's general demeanor on his visit to Beijing, and that's why it does open up an interesting window for American recalibration. But so much of this is going to depend upon whether President Trump has the ability to carry the day domestically in terms of the politics of things. The Taiwan stuff, I know that people, particularly pro-independent types, got very anxious over all of this stuff. But my own sense is that they probably have less to be anxious about from his words, and actually a lot more to, and they should get no comfort, by the way, from the noises of support that they get out of Washington. Those noises will always be there. What they really should be concerned about is not what Washington says, but whether or not Washington actually has not just the intent, but actually the ability to sustain the security architecture that Taipei has depended upon for all of these years. And frankly put, I don't think it can. Now, if that understanding progressively internalizes across the minds of ordinary residents on the island and ultimately into the political apparatus and importantly into the military apparatus, the kinds of calculations that will start to play out on the island itself will change. We're not talking about people suddenly having a road to Damascus conversion on the island to the idea of communism or whatever. We're literally just talking about a confrontation with reality, and of course a deep-seated desire to be able to pursue lives that are relatively peaceful and that have a good chance of flourishing. And if the Americans can't actually deliver the security architecture, let alone the economic foundations, then people on the island will start to have serious rethink. I think the thing that's really shaken people is arguably the very non-ideological attitude that President Trump has taken in relation to the island, and that became very apparent when he again talked about the island as having stolen America's semiconductor industry, right? And ongoing pressure for that industry, or more to the point, TSMC, to relocate to America. Now, if I was, somebody on the island and my instincts was towards independence or at least something resembling the status quo, the idea that an American president has actually just said, look, your most valuable thing to us is something that we're going to try and lift off the island and move to the mainland of America, that would concern me greatly. So you package all of that together, I'm less concerned, or I would be less concerned about President Trump talking about the island being a long way away. And I'd be a lot more concerned about President Trump's obvious limited commitment to the island beyond its semiconductors and the material reality. The United States actually just simply no longer has the wherewithal to sustain its deterrence posture in Asia. End of story. The world's changed.